Washington has delivered Canada an extraordinary message. The United States may impose new 50% tariffs on billions of dollars in Canadian goods. But if Canada retaliates, the Trump administration says it will punish Canada again. Now, with the August 19th deadline rapidly approaching, Prime Minister Mark Carney faces a defining choice. Should Canada make concessions to protect Canadian jobs, or should Ottawa stand firm and prepare to fight back? U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer issued the warning while speaking to reporters in Des Moines, Iowa. Greer said the Trump administration does not consider the current confrontation a trade war. He described it as an effort to protect American workers, industries, and domestic supply chains. But he also made Washington's position unmistakably clear. If another country retaliates against American tariffs, the United States will not tolerate it and will take further action. That warning directly conflicts with the message coming from Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union. Unifor National President Lana Payne says Canada should stop offering concessions. If the new tariffs take effect, she believes Canada should retaliate forcefully. Canada is now being pulled between two completely different strategies, and the decision could affect thousands of workers on both sides of the border. Unless an agreement is reached, 3 separate American tariff proclamations will take effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19th. The measures would impose additional 50% tariffs on hundreds of Canadian products representing approximately $20 billion in exports. This is not a blanket tariff on everything Canada sells to the United States. Energy, potash, fish, critical minerals, and goods already facing Section 232 tariffs are excluded. However, the affected products could include wine, cement, sporting goods, furniture, textiles, and other manufactured products. There is another major concern for Canadian exporters. The tariffs will apply to covered goods even if they comply with the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known as CUSMA. That means businesses that followed continental trade rules could still face a sudden 50% charge when their products enter the United States. The new measures would also exist alongside tariffs already affecting Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, and other major industries. The Trump administration says the tariffs are a response to 3 Canadian policies. First, most Canadian provinces and territories removed American alcohol from their liquor systems after earlier U.S. tariffs were introduced. Ontario Premier Doug Ford directed the LCBO to stop purchasing and selling American alcohol. Quebec Premier François Legault introduced similar restrictions through the SAQ. Second, Canada imposed counter-tariffs on American vehicles and auto parts. Third, Washington is challenging how Canada administers tariff rate quotas for American dairy products, particularly cheese. Greer has argued that these measures discriminate against American businesses. He even compared Canada's actions to tactics used by China. Canadian officials reject that comparison. They argue that the alcohol restrictions and vehicle tariffs were defensive actions introduced after Washington targeted Canadian industries. In other words, what each government calls retaliation depends on where it chooses to begin the story. The United States says it is responding to Canada. Canada says it was responding to the United States. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Trade Negotiator Janice Charette have been meeting repeatedly with Greer in Washington. Their latest meeting was the 4th between LeBlanc and Greer in approximately 3 weeks. The American side has reportedly offered to reduce some existing sectoral tariffs, but Canadian officials do not believe the proposed reductions go far enough. Ottawa wants the incoming 50% tariffs cancelled. It is also seeking meaningful relief for steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, and other industries already under pressure. Canada is reportedly prepared to consider movement on provincial alcohol restrictions, vehicle counter-tariffs, and the administration of existing dairy import quotas. But none of those possible concessions has been finalized. Mark Carney and Donald Trump are expected to receive options for a potential agreement, possibly as early as Monday. Canadian officials reportedly view August 19th as a critical political deadline. If the tariffs take effect, there may be little public support for continuing negotiations without a much stronger Canadian response. Carney is also facing growing pressure from Canadian workers, farmers, and political leaders. Universe Lana Payne says Canada has already created economic leverage and should not surrender it. The United States depends on Canadian energy, potash, aluminum, and other strategically important resources. Payne believes those dependencies give Ottawa the power to resist American pressure. Dairy Farmers of Canada is also warning the government not to sacrifice supply management. The organization says American dairy exports to Canada already exceed Canadian dairy exports to the United States by more than $600 million annually. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet has reminded the government that Parliament passed Bill C-202, which protects dairy, poultry, and egg import quotas from further concessions in future trade agreements. There may be limited room to change how existing dairy quotas are administered, but increasing the quotas or reducing above quota tariffs would cross a legal and political red line. Alcohol creates another complication. Ottawa conducts trade negotiations, but provincial governments control their liquor purchasing and distribution systems. Carney cannot simply guarantee the return of American alcohol without cooperation from leaders such as Doug Ford and François Legault. Canada would likely experience the larger proportional economic impact from a prolonged confrontation because Canadian exporters depend heavily on the American market. But the United States would also suffer. An Oxford economic study estimates that a complete breakdown of CUSMA could eventually result in 214,000 fewer American jobs and 102,000 fewer Canadian jobs compared with its status quo scenario. Those numbers are not a direct forecast of what will happen on August 19th. They demonstrate how damaging the dispute could become if temporary tariffs turn into a permanent breakdown of North American trade. American manufacturers depend on Canadian metals, energy, and components. Canadian manufacturers depend on American customers and integrated supply chains. When tariffs raise costs at the border, businesses and consumers in both countries ultimately pay the price. Canada now faces three possible outcomes. Carney and Trump could reach a last-minute agreement that prevents the new tariffs and reduces some existing ones. Trump could delay or modify the August 19th measures while negotiations continue. Or the tariffs could take effect, forcing Canada to choose between further concessions, targeted retaliation, or a much broader economic response. A balanced agreement that requires both countries to remove barriers would protect workers and restore stability. But a one-sided agreement could encourage Washington to return with even greater demands. At the same time, unlimited retaliation could threaten Canadian factories, investment, and jobs. This dispute is no longer simply about alcohol, automobiles, or dairy. It is about whether Canada can defend its economy without triggering further punishment from its closest trading partner. Washington says Canada must not retaliate. Universe says Canada must not surrender. And on August 19th, Mark Carney may have to decide which warning carries the greater risk.